Welcome to Let's Talk Criterion, and in this edition we look at the 1960 film from British director Michael Powell, Peeping Tom. Now, there were two films that, for me, resonated about serial killers in the 1960s and early 1970s. They were both psychological horror thrillers. One was 10 Rillington Place, and the other was Peeping Tom. Now, one was based on a real person, John Christie, and the other on a fictional character, the killer Mark Lewis. Now, Michael Powell worked for many years with another prestigious filmmaker, that of course was Emmerich Pressburger, through their production company in Britain called The Archers. Together, they wrote, produced and directed a series of classic British films, notably The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, A Canterbury Tale, I Know Where I'm Going, A Matter of Life and Death, also called Stairway to Heaven, Black Narcissus, The Red Shoes, and The Tales of Hoffman. Now, Criterion have many, if not all of these, in the Criterion collection. And this partnership formed back in the late 1930s. For this project, Michael Powell had moved away from Pressburger. The controversial 1960 film Peeping Tom. This was so vilified on first release that it had seriously damaged his career, and it's now considered as a classic and a contender, in fact, for the first slasher movie. Many renowned filmmakers such as Francis Ford Coppola, George A. Romero, and Martin Scorsese have cited Powell as an influence in their work. The film was excoriated by British critics who were offended by its sexual and violent imagery. Powell was ostracised as a result by the film industry and found it almost impossible to work thereafter. And here we are now in the 21st century, and we can certainly look back and better appreciate the film for what he intended it to be. Mark Lewis is played by Carl Bone. He's a young photographer who lives in London and covets beautiful girls and wants to capture their final moments of fear on film as part of his ongoing documentary which studies fear. Now, he engineers his meetings to be in a really strong position to use the camera itself, or rather, the apparatus attached to the camera, as his murder weapon. He is not suspected by anyone, including his blind landlady, Maxine Audley, and a rather naive daughter, Anna Massey, who he doesn't pay much attention to at all at first, and in fact he's rather embarrassed around. They usually encounter each other exchanging words on the stairs as he comes and goes. He works at a film studio and shoots publicity shots for them, as well as doing sultry photos for commercial use on the side. This gives him an ideal opportunity, of course, to prey on the girls that come and go. Now, he also hangs out with prostitutes and photographs them, as well as attacking and killing the occasional one. Now, Mark's need to capture the final agonising pain and suffering of these young women is deeply seated, and it goes back to his childhood, and in fact his relationship with his late father, who tortured Mark by subjecting him to fear in certain artificial situations. He has inherited all of his father's equipment. The style of shooting was unique here, as Powell decided to see the horrific acts occur with a viewfinder, seeing his point of view, which left audiences at the time in fear and somewhat repulsed by the film. Now, as you can see, you're looking at me from a different viewpoint. As I said, we can appreciate this unique way of letting us see the killer's viewpoint, and in fact many directors have copied this technique throughout the years, and it became the staple technique used in slasher movies. Now, the film often looks at voyeurism. Mark often films people passing by in the street, for instance, from a secluded place, without them being aware he's doing it. He is very much obsessed by capturing their images on film. Now, this boils down to him eventually quantifying his choices by watching these kill films back in his apartment later. Now, this was something that audiences were not at all comfortable with at that time. It affected them somehow on a psychological level, which I dare say was Powell's actual intention. But the film was rather too raw for them to take, and this caused considerable derision and critics to universally pan the film. The nudity and references to domestic abuse in the film that Powell sought to include were also cut at the insistence of the BBFC, that's the British Board of Film Censors, who also demanded changes to the murders of Dora, that's Brenda Bruce, and Vivian, the on-set stand-in, Moira Shearer, and the film was eventually awarded an X certificate. According to the BBFC's website, an attempt to find the excised footage resulted in a lengthy delay when a video version of the film was released as an 18 certificate in the UK in 1996. Now, tellingly, when Peeping Tom emerged on DVD in 2007, the age rating had dropped again to 15, and this certainly provides a clue to the shifting attitude we've had towards the content of the film since 1960. Chris Rodley's documentary, A Very British Psycho from 1997, draws comparisons between Peeping Tom and Hitchcock's Psycho, and the latter film was given its New York premiere in June of 1960, 2 months after Peeping Tom's premiere in London. Both films feature protagonists, typically mild-mannered serial killers, who are obsessed with their parents. However, despite containing material similar to Peeping Tom, Psycho became a box office success and only increased the popularity and the fame of its director, although the film itself was widely criticised in the English press, funnily. Now, one reason suggested in the documentary is that Hitchcock, seeing the negative press reaction to Peeping Tom in the UK, decided to release Psycho without even giving it a press screening. In 1963, Ian Johnson published his essay A Pin to See the Peep Show in the film magazine Motion. Now, this essay explored Michael Powell's stance on voyeurism, while also offering a Freudian analysis of his use of phallic symbolism, castration anxiety, and the Oedipus complex. 2 years previous, Raymond Durgnat had discussed the picture in eroticism in cinema for films and filming. Now, he wrote that films such as Peeping Tom look at the pattern of guilt, terror, suspicion, pity, and hope against hope. Now, people don't just see this film, they join in and identify and participate. They are more than just passive spectators watching entertainment. Now, casting on the film was interesting as well. Dirk Bogarde, for instance, was in the frame for the lead, but Michael Powell chose Carl Bohm for the lead role, and he occupies nearly all of the screen time. Anna Massey plays Helen Stevens. Moira Shearer, the Scottish actress who starred in Powell and Pressburger's The Red Shoes, she, of course, played the dancer who appeared in the studio, including Maxine Audley as Mrs. Stevens and Brenda Bruce as Dora. And then there was a gentleman called Miles Mallison, playing an elderly gentleman customer, and Michael Powell himself in an uncredited cameo. The film was taken out of distribution just 5 days after its release, but nowadays we can view Peeping Tom in modern terms and appreciate it as a groundbreaking film in many ways for its depiction of sexual content, phallic symbolism, voyeurism, and use of unique film technique. Michael Powell employed Brian Easdale to compose the score for the film. Now, this a mainly piano-based score throughout. Now, this 4K presentation comes to the Criterion Collection and has been restored by the Film Foundation and BFI National Archives in association with Studio Canal. It was restored using the original 35mm Eastman colour negative, optical track and track positive print. 4K scanning was done at Silver Salt Restoration in London, with picture restoration by Cineric in New York. Colour grading was done by Daniel De Vincent, also at Cineric. And Studio Canal have already released this in a 4K edition in the UK back in January of this year. And it's the same restoration, of course, that comes to the Criterion Collection with the following special features. New 4K digital restoration with uncompressed mono soundtrack. One 4K UHD disc of the film, presented in Dolby Vision HDR, and one Blu-ray with the film and these special features. 2 audio commentaries, one featuring film historian Ian Christie and one featuring film scholar Laura Mulvey. Introduction by the filmmaker Martin Scorsese. Interview with editor Thelma Schoonmaker. Documentary about the film's main history, featuring interviews with Schoonmaker, Scorsese and actor Carl Bohm. Documentary about screenwriter Leo Marx. Programme on the film's restoration. A trailer. And, of course, as always, an essay by the author Megan Abbott. And we have new cover art from a regular contributor to Criterion, that's Eric Skillman. Peeping Tom, despite the apparent hatred and derision for it back when it was released in 1960, has rightly been preserved for prosperity. It has a running time of 101 minutes, and it comes in a 1:6:6:1 aspect ratio and gets its well-deserved UHD upgrade within the Criterion collection on Tuesday the 14th of May, with existing spine 58. In the next edition, we'll be looking at 3 films from African director Ousmane Sembène. So until next time from me, it's goodbye, and above all, good Criterion viewing.